Okay, so in pages 1 through 3, we have Ben talking about the native individuals of the island of Suriname. And now the next part is she's going to talk about, and this is different, the slaves who she's calling Negroes or Black individuals. And they've been taken from different countries in Africa. And then this is where we're going to learn about Oroonooko. Okay, so she says, then though those then whom we make use of to work in our plantations of sugar are Negroes, black slaves altogether, who are transported thither in this manner. Those who want slaves make a bargain with a master or a captain of a ship, and contract to pay him so much apiece, a matter of £20 a head for as many as he agrees for, and to pay him for when they shall be delivered on such a plantation, so that when there arise a ship laden with slaves, they who have so contracted go aboard and receive their number by lot. And perhaps in one lot that may be for 10, there may happen to be 3 or 4 men, the rest women and children. Or be there more or less of either sex, you are obliged to be contented with your lot. Coromantien, a country of blacks so called, was one of those places in which they found the most advantageous trading for these slaves. And thither most of our great traders in that merchandise traffic, for that nation is very warlike and brave, and having a continual campaign, being always in hostility with one neighboring prince or other, they had the fortune to take a great many captives, for all that they took in battle were sold as slaves. At least those common men who could not ransom themselves of those slaves so taken, the general only has all the profit, and of these generals are captains and masters of ships by all their freights. The king of Coromantien was himself a man of 100 and odd years old, and had no son, though he had many beautiful black wives, for most certainly there are beauties that can charm of that color. In his younger years, he had many gallant men to his sons, 13 of whom died in battle, conquering when they fell, and he had only left him for his successor one grandchild, son to one of those dead victors, who, as soon as he could bear a bow in his hand and a quiver at his back, was sent into the field to be trained up by one of the oldest generals to war, where, from his natural inclination to arms and the occasions given him, with the good conduct of the old general, he became, at the age of 17, one of the most expert captains and bravest soldiers that ever saw the field of Mars, so that he was adored as the wonder of all that world, and darling of the soldiers. Besides, he was adorned with a native beauty so transcending all those of his gloomy race that he struck in awe and reverence even into those that knew not his quality, as he did into me, who beheld him with surprise and wonder, when afterwards he arrived in our world. Okay, so in this section, after describing how the slaves are auctioned to the plantations in Suriname, she begins to describe Coromantien, which we'll find out is where our protagonist, Oroonooko, is from. And he happens to be the grandson of the king. The king, she explains, has no successors because all of his sons died in battle. And so his only surviving uh his only the only person surviving in the line of succession is his grandson Oroonooko. And the king himself, it says, is 100 and some odd years, so an incredibly old man. And he also explains that it has many wives, which we'll find out is important later. So now we're describing Oroonooko, and he is 17 years old, so that's what this part is explaining. He had scarce arrived at his 17th year when, fighting by his side, the general was killed with an arrow in his eye, which the Prince Oroonooko, for so was this gallant more called, very narrowly avoided. Nor had he, if the general, who saw the arrow shot and perceiving it aimed at the prince, had not bowed his head between on purpose to receive it in his own body, rather than it should touch that of the prince, and so saved him. All right, so at this point in the story, she is telling us the beginning of Oroonoko's story, which is that he's 17, he's in battle, and he's now been saved by a general who saw an arrow that was aimed at him and took the arrow in his place. And it was then, afflicted as Oroonooko was, that he was proclaimed general in the old man's place. And then it was at the finishing of that war, which had continued for 2 years, that the prince came to court, where he had hardly been a month together, from the time of his 5th year to that of 17. Okay, so this is just explaining that he's then named general after the other general dies, and because of this, he's ordered to go back to court. And it says he hadn't been to court or really outside of the battlefield from the time that he was 5 until the time he was 17. So this is really a new experience for him that he's going to. And 'twas amazing to imagine where it was he learned so much humanity, or to give his accomplishments a juster name, was 'twas he got that real greatness of soul, those refined notions of true honor, that absolute generosity, and that softness that was capable of the highest passions of love and gallantry, whose objects were almost continually fighting men, or those mangled or dead, who heard no sounds but those of war and groans. Some of it we may attribute to the care of a Frenchman of wit and learning, who finding it turn to very good account to be a sort of royal tutor to this young black, and perceiving him very ready, apt, and quick of apprehension, took a great pleasure to teach him morals, language, and science, and was for it extremely beloved and valued by him. Another reason he was loved when he came from war, to see all the English gentlemen that gathered thither, and did not only learn their language, but that of the Spaniard also, with whom he traded afterwards for slaves. So in this section, After Ben is just explaining to us that you might assume that Oroonooko might be a little bit wild, being as that he had been on the battlefield frequently. That's really what he was trained to do. But she said that he was actually very accomplished and like very gentlemanlike, because he had had a tutor who was French, who basically taught him everything that you would learn in school as he was growing up. So not only was he very powerful and excellent in battle, but he was also very, very educated and well read. And not only did he speak the language of his country, he was also able to speak English and Spanish, and I believe French in this from this tutor. So she continues by saying, I have often seen and conversed with this great man, and been a witness to many of his mighty actions, and do assure my reader, the most illustrious courts could not have produced a braver man, both for greatness of courage and mind, a judgment more solid, a wit more quick, and a conversation more sweet and diverting. He knew almost as much as if he had read much. He had heard of and admired the Romans. He had heard of the late civil wars in England, and the deplorable death of our great monarch, and would discourse of it with all the sense and abhorrence of the injustice imaginable. He had an extreme good and graceful mien, and all the civility of a well-bred great man. He had nothing of barbarity in his nature, but in all points dressed himself as if his education had been in some European court. So here she's basically just explaining that he is so well-read, so well-educated, and such an excellent soldier that it is almost difficult for her and anyone who's European who met him to believe that he was actually of African descent. Because at that time, you may be familiar that people really saw Black individuals as beneath them or below them, or they didn't really see slaves as having much value. And so Oroonooko is very different, shows a very different side of this idea that Black individuals aren't educated, or they aren't kind or good or brave or any of those things. And she's saying that he actually shows himself to be greater than any of the men she's ever seen or met or heard of in the European or English court. So this great and just character of Oroonooko gave me an extreme curiosity to see him, especially when I knew he spoke French and English, and that I could talk with him. But though I had heard so much of him, I was as greatly surprised when I saw him as if I had heard nothing of him. So beyond all report I found him. He came into the room and addressed himself to me and some other women with the best grace in the world. He was pretty tall, but of a shape of the most exact that can be fancied. The most famous statuary could not form the figure of a man more admirably turned from head to foot. His face was not of that brown, rusty black, which most of that nation are, but of perfect ebony or polished jet. His eyes were the most awful that could be seen, and very piercing, the white of them being like snow, as were his teeth. His nose was rising and Roman, instead of African and flat. His mouth was the finest shape that could be seen, far from those great turned lips which are so natural to the rest of the Negroes. The whole proportion and air of his face was so nobly and exactly formed that, bating his color, there could be nothing in nature more beautiful, agreeable, and handsome. There was no one grace wanting that bears the standard of true beauty. His hair came down to his shoulders by the aids of art, which was by pulling it out with a quill and keeping it combed, of which he took particular care. Nor did the perfections of his mind come short of those of his person, for his discourse was admirable upon almost any subject, and whoever had heard him speak would have been convinced of their errors, that all fine wit is confined to the white men, especially to those of Christendom, and would have confessed that Oroonooko was as capable even of reigning well and of governing as wisely, had as great a soul as politic maxims, and was as sensible of power as any prince civilized in the most refined schools of humanity and learning, or the most illustrious courts. The prince, such as I have described him, whose soul and body were so admirably adorned, was, while yet he was in the court of his grandfather, as I said, as capable of love as 'twas possible for a brave and gallant man to be. And in saying that, I have named the highest degree of love, for sure great souls are most capable of that passion. I have already said that the old general was killed by the shot of an arrow by the side of this prince in battle, and that Oroonooko was made general. This old dead hero had only one daughter left of his race, a beauty that to describe her truly, one need say only, she was female to the noble male, the beautiful black Venus to our young Mars, as charming in her person as he, and of delicate virtues. I've seen 100 white men sighing after her and making 1,000 vows at her feet, all in vain and unsuccessful, and she was indeed too great for any but a prince of her own nation to adore. So guys, here we're getting some foreshadowing, right? She's now described to us what a wonderful character and person and individual Oroonooko is. And he's a prince. In addition to that, she's also just gone through describing how incredibly handsome and attractive he is. And so this is where we get to the foreshadowing where she introduces another character, a young lady who happens to be the daughter or the only daughter of the general that saved him in battle. Okay, so our foreshadowing here is that he is going to meet her. And in this paragraph here, our author is basically saying that she is his true equal in beauty and intelligence and in wit and cleverness and in strength. Continuing on, we have Oroonooko coming from the wars which were now ended. After he had made his court to his grandfather, he thought in honor he ought to make a visit to Imawenda. Okay, so now we know her name. Her name is Imawenda, the daughter of his foster father, the dead general, and to make some excuses to her, because his preservation was the occasion of her father's death, and to present her with those slaves he had taken in the last battle as the trophies of her father's victories. Okay, so now we know the reason that he's being introduced to Imawenda is to tell her about her father's death, and as a token of his appreciation for his life being saved, he is going to offer her all the slaves that were taken in that battle. When he came, attended by all the young soldiers of any merit, he was infinitely surprised at the beauty of this fair queen of night, whose face and person was so exceeding all he had ever beheld, that lovely modesty with which she received him, that softness in her look and sighs, upon the melancholy occasion of this honor that was done by so great a man as Oroonooko, and a prince of whom she had heard such admirable things, the awfulness wherewith she received him, and the sweetness of her words and behavior while he stayed, gained a perfect conquest over his fierce heart, and made him feel the victor could be subdued. So that having made his first compliments and presented her 150 slaves in fetters, he told her with his eyes that he was not insensible of her charms, while Imawenda, wished for nothing more than so glorious a conquest, was pleased to believe she understood that silent language of newborn love, and from that moment put on all her additions to beauty. So guys, this was basically just describing, they have this love at first sight moment. Even though they're in this terrible situation where he's explaining to her, hey, I'm very sorry your father died, so that's why I'm bringing you this gift. He is so taken by how kindly she acts towards him and everything that he begins to immediately fall in love with her. And she feels the exact same way about him. The prince returned to court with quite another humor than before. Right? So, guys, when it says another humor, it just means that, like, his emotional state changed. So he may have gone there feeling very sad, and now he's coming back because he is fallen in love. And though he did not speak much at the fair in Melinda, he had the pleasure to hear all his followers speak of nothing but the charms of that maid, and so much that even in the presence of the old king, they were extolling her and heightening, if possible, the beauties they had found in her, so that nothing else was talked of. No other sound was heard in every corner where there were whispers, but Imoinda, Imoinda. All right, so now when he gets back to court, he's not the only one thinking about her. Because other people were with him and he had other followers, they're all talking about what a great and wonderful beauty she is. And there's a little bit of foreshadowing, but the king is also going to hear all these wonderful things about this beautiful, lovely woman. So 'twill be imagined Oroonooko stayed not long before he made his second visit. He goes back to see Melinda, nor considering his quality not much longer before he told her he adored her. I have often heard him say that he admired by what strange inspiration he came to talk things so soft and so passionate, who never knew love, nor was used to the conversation of women, but, to use his own words, he said, most happily some new and, till then, unknown power instructed his heart and tongue in the language of love, and at the same time in favor of him inspired Melinda with a sense of his passion. She was touched with what he said and returned it all in such answers as went to his very heart with a pleasure unknown before. Nor did he use those obligations ill that love had done him, but turned all his happy moments to the best advantage. And as he knew no vice, his flame aimed at nothing but honor, if such a distinction may be made in love, and especially in that country where men take to themselves as many as they can obtain. Guys, I'm going to stop there to explain. So, this is talking a little bit about the fact that in the country where Oroonooko comes from, and we've talked about before, the king has many, many wives. So Emerwinda realizes that because he's a prince, she has to be a little bit careful around him. Right? She can't just go out and say, hey, I love you too, because he could really maybe not mean what he's saying. Maybe he's just saying this because she knows she's beautiful. He knows she's beautiful. So she's trying to avoid a situation where he takes her as a wife and then she's not really that important to him. But in all of his visits, she starts to realize that he's truly sincere in his love. And she tries to show that she's also sincere in her love. Okay, and then it continues because then it says the only crime and sin with women is to turn her off, to abandon her to want, shame, and misery. And such ill morals are only practiced in Christian countries, where they prefer the bare name of religion and that without virtue or morality think that sufficient. Okay, so again, those are her fears, so that she may be abandoned to want, shame, and misery, because that's really the greatest crime you can commit against a woman. But Oroonooko was none of those professors. But as he had right notions of honor, so he made her such propositions as were not only and barely such, but contrary to the custom of his country. All right, so he realizes that she's afraid that she's just going to become another woman in a string of women. And he's like, no, baby, you're the only one for me. And so he continues to say nice and beautiful things to her. So he made her vows that she should be the only woman he would possess while he lived. So he says, hey, I'm not going to take any other wives. Very different from other men and other royals in his country. That no age or wrinkle should incline him to change. So he's saying that even if you grow older, which was another reason that many of the royals would take another wife, he says, you'll still be the only one for me. For her soul would always be fine and always young, and he should have an eternal idea in his mind of the charm she now bore, and should look into her heart for that idea when he could no longer find it in her face. So after 1,000 assurances of his lasting flame and her eternal empire over him, she condescended to receive him for her husband, or rather received him as the greatest honor the gods could do her. There is a certain ceremony in these cases to be observed, which I forgot to ask how 'twas performed, but 'twas concluded on both sides, that in obedience to him, the grandfather was to be made acquainted with the design, for they pay a most absolute resignation to the monarch, especially when he is a parent also. Okay, so she's saying that there's not a marriage in the same way that we would have a marriage here, but she does said that there was an important thing that had to be done. They had to let the king know that they wanted to be husband and wife. But on the other side, the old king, who had many wives and many concubines, wanted not court flatterers to insinuate into his heart 1,000 tender thoughts for this young beauty, and who represented her to his fancy as the most charming he had ever possessed in all the long race of his numerous years. At this character, his old heart, like an extinguished brand, most apt to take fire, felt new sparks of love and began to kindle, and now, grown to his second childhood, longed with impatience to behold this gay thing, with whom, alas, he could but innocently play. All right, now I said that all the people in the court had already been talking about Imawenda, and so the king has already gotten into his head that he would like this beautiful young woman to be part of his royal harem. So she may not necessarily be his wife or one of his wives, but she definitely could be one of his concubines, which would be a woman that lived within the confines of the court and could be called upon to satisfy the needs of the king at any time. So he's not in love with her, but she's beautiful, she's new, and she's something he's never had before, and that interests him. But how he should be confirmed, she was this wonder before he used his power to call her to court, where maidens never came unless for the king's private use. He was next to consider. And while he was doing so, he had intelligence brought to him that Imawenda was most certainly mistress to the Prince Oroonooko. So guys, again, these two things are happening simultaneously. Oroonooko is telling Imawenda that he wants to take her as his wife, and his grandfather wants to take her as his mistress. Now, they use the word mistress here for Oroonooko because they knew that they were in a relationship, but they didn't know the status of that relationship. So now the king gets jealous because even though he realizes she's a perfect fit for his grandson, they're the same age, they're both young and in love, he just wants what he cannot have. So this gave him some chagrin because he doesn't want to upset his grandson. However, it gave him also an opportunity one day when the prince was a hunting to wait on a man of quality as his slave and attendant who should go and make a present to Imawenda as from the prince. Right? So he makes this plan that one day while the prince is away, he's going to pretend that he's the prince and bring her a gift. And he should then, unknown, see this fair maid and have the opportunity to hear what message she would return the prince for his present, and from thence gather the state of her heart and degree of her inclination. So now he's sneaky. He sends this guy to give Imawenda a present. The guy has to pretend the present's from Oroonooko. And then, instead of bringing the message Imawenda gives for the gift back to Oroonooko, he's got to tell the king exactly how Imawenda feels. So this was put in execution, and the old monarch saw and burned. He found her all he had heard, and would not delay his happiness, but found he should have some obstacle to overcome her heart. For she expressed her sense of the present the prince had sent her in terms so sweet, so soft and pretty, with an air of love and joy, that could not be dissembled, insomuch that 'twas past doubt whether she loved Oroonooko entirely. Right, so basically, he figures out this girl is deeply in love with his grandson. And so he has to decide, is he going to do what he wants and take this woman to be his mistress and deeply upset her and deeply upset his grandson? Or is he going to let his grandson be happy? And so the king decides that while it makes him feel a little bit icky, that the obedience that people pay their king was not at all inferior to what they paid their gods. And what love would not oblige Imawenda to do, duty would compel her to. So he concludes that, meh, I don't really care enough about how they feel. I'm a king. That makes me a god. I get what I want. And so if she doesn't want to do this, that's okay because she's obliged to. I'm the dang king. So he was therefore no sooner got to his apartment, but he sent the royal veil to Imawenda, and that is a ceremony of invitation. He sends the lady he has in mind to honor with his bed a veil with which she is covered and secured for the king's use, and 'tis death to disobey, besides how the most impious disobedience. Okay, so again, he's made his decision. And so the way that he tells Imawenda that she is going to be his mistress is he's going to send her this head covering that will cover her face entirely. It may even be long enough to cover her body. And she is going to be brought to him as a present. And now we know Imawenda, this is the one thing that she did not want. And that's why she was so careful with what she said and did with Oroonooko. So 'twas not to be imagined the surprise and grief that seized the lovely maid at this news and sight. However, as delays in these cases are dangerous and pleading worse than treason, trembling and almost fainting, she was obliged to suffer herself to be covered and led away. They brought her thus to court, and the king, who had caused a very rich bath to be prepared, was led into it, where he sat under a canopy in state to receive this longed for virgin, whom he having commanded should be brought to him. They, after disrobing her, led her to the bath, and making fast the doors, left her to descend. The king, without more courtship, bade her throw off her mantle and come to his arms. Guys, this basically quick summary is that he is not showing any type of romance whatsoever. He's basically said, you need to take off your clothes. I have drawn a bath. I am in the bath. I am not wearing clothing. You are not wearing clothing. Please come and join me. And then when she's done so, he immediately grabs her in for an embrace. But Imawenda, all in tears, threw herself on the marble on the brink of the bath. Okay, so she's so overwhelmed. She does not want any of this, that she can't even make it into the bath, that she throws herself onto the marble floor in front of it. And she told him, and she besought him to hear her. So she's like, you need to listen to me. She told him, as she was a maid, how proud of the divine glory she should have been, and of having it in her power to oblige her king. But as by the laws he could not, and from his royal goodness would not, take any man from his wedded wife. So she believed she should be on the occasion of making him commit a great sin, as she did not reveal her state and condition and tell him she was another's, and could not be so happy to be his. Okay, so she basically tells him that, yes, it is your right as my king to demand this of me. If I feel like I could make you happy, I would love to do so, but there's a little catch. As far as she is concerned, and as far as Oroonooko are concerned, they have basically wed in secret. They consider themselves to be husband and wife. And so she points out another law that basically says, you're going to be committing a sin if you take a wife away from her husband. So the king is enraged because this is a delay. He has to find out, is it true? Are they truly married? Is he committing a sin? Is he committing a crime by taking the wife of another man? So he hastily demanded the name of the bold man that had married a woman of her degree without his consent. Imawenda, seeing his eyes fierce and his hands tremble, whether with age or anger, I know not, but she fancied the last, almost repented she had said so much, for now she feared the storm would fall on the prince. She therefore said 1,000 things to appear the raging of his flame, and to prepare him to hear who it was with calmness. But before she spoke, He imagined who she meant, but would not seem to do so, but commanded her to lay aside her mantle and suffer herself to receive his caresses. Or, by his gods, he swore that happy man whom she was going to name should die, though it were even Oroonooko himself. So he basically says, honey, you have a choice. You can come and do what I've commanded you to do, and you can deny your marriage because in his mind, he's already pretty sure it's Oroonooko. He doesn't even care who she says. And she's terrified to admit to him now that it is Oroonooko because she senses he's going to murder whoever this is to make sure she doesn't have a husband. So he says, deny this marriage and swear thyself a maid. I need you to go ahead and deny whoever your husband is and tell me that you're not married. So Imawenda, scared that he's going to murder Oroonooko, says, that, replied Imawenda, by all powers, I do, for I'm not yet known to my husband. So basically, she concludes that since her and her husband have not sealed the deal in bed, she technically could be considered unmarried. Because usually at that time, in that age, a marriage was not considered complete until a man and a woman had slept together after their wedding night, which they had not had the opportunity to do. So the king says, "'Tis enough. 'Tis enough both to satisfy my conscience and my heart." And rising from his seat, he went and led her into the bath, it being in vain for her to resist. Okay, so all this happens while Oroonoko's gone. He's out hunting. So in this time, the prince who returned from hunting went to visit his Imawenda, but found her gone. And not only so, but heard she had received the royal veil. All right, so he comes back from hunting, finds out the king, who knows that he's in love with her, that he knew maybe the king would want, has actually declared that she is now his mistress. So this raised him to a storm, and in his madness, they had much ado to save him from laying violent hands on himself. All right, so because he's so enraged, can't take out his anger on the king, so he sort of takes it out on himself. So it says, force first prevailed and then reason. They urged all to him that it might oppose his rage. But nothing weighed so greatly with him as the king's old age, incapable of injuring him with Imawenda. All right, so he finally relaxes and he's like, the king's too old. Like, I can't even duel this man. Like, he's 100, like he can't even fight me properly. So he would give way to hope because it pleased him most and flattered best his heart. Yet this served not to altogether to make him cease his different passions, which sometimes raged within him and softened into showers. 'Twas not enough to appease him, to tell him his grandfather was old and could not that way injure him, while he retained the awful duty which the young men are used there to pay to their grave relations. He could not be convinced he had no cause to sigh and mourn for the loss of a mistress he could not, with all his strength and courage, retrieve. And he would often cry, "Oh, my friends, were she in walled cities or confined from me in fortifications of the greatest strength, did enchantments or monsters detain her from me, I would venture through any hazard to free her. But here in the arms of a feeble old man, my youth, my violent love, my trade in arms, and all my vast desire of glory avail me to nothing, to nothing." So he's basically saying that he wished that she were captured in some other place where he could fight a war to save her. Basically, he wishes that he could be like Prince Charming, storm a castle to go and save her. But there's no way that he can fight his own grandfather because not only would it be immoral, it wouldn't even be a fair fight. And the king's reign is absolute and just, and he doesn't want to cause that type of rift in their relationship. So he declares that Imawenda is as irrevocably lost to me as if she were snatched by the cold arms of death. So basically, he says, with her being the mistress of the king, she might as well be dead because there's no way that I'm getting her back. Oh, she's never to be retrieved. If I would wait tedious years till fate should bow the king to his grave, even that would not leave me Imawenda free, but still that custom that makes it so vile a crime for a son to marry his father's wives or mistresses would hinder my happiness. So, like, all of us were thinking, well, he's old, so maybe he could die and you can marry her. But Oroonooko says, nope, can't even do that because the law of our country says that it is a vile crime, sort of like incest almost, for a son or a grandson to take a woman who has been the mistress or a wife of a father or a grandfather. And so even then, he couldn't be happy because he said, either I would ignobly set an ill precedent to my successors. So basically, like that would be, he would be giving that opportunity to people, to his children who came after him, and they might take advantage of it in a not so happy way. And he says, or I could abandon my country and fly with her to some unknown world who never heard our story. But it was objected to him that his case was not the same. So his friends step in and say, hey, maybe you're not thinking quite clearly about this. Maybe it's not as bad as you're thinking. Because Imawinda, being his lawful wife by solemn contract, they still had the verbal spoken contract that they were husband and wife, meaning that 'twas he who was the injured man and might, if he so pleased, take Imawinda back, the breach of the law being on his grandfather's side. All right, so just like his grandfather had feared that her being married could impede them being together, his friends are saying, okay, you guys didn't exactly seal the deal, but you got a verbal contract. That is good enough. Like we really respect that in our country. So your grandfather is the one who's committed the crime, not you. So you really should be able to get Imawinda back. And to do so, he would need to circumvent the king and redeem her from the Otan, which is the palace of the king's women, a sort of seraglio. It was both just and lawful for him to do so. Okay, so they're talking about possibly him breaking into the special section of the palace that is just for the king's wives and mistresses. Like that's where they all live. It's a guarded area. So this reasoning had some force upon him, and he should have been entirely comforted, but for the thought that she was possessed by his grandfather. So he feels like he should be happy by this, but he's still not, because right now she's still in the clutches of his grandfather. However, he loved so well that he was resolved to believe what most favored his hope, and to endeavor to learn from Imawinda's own mouth what only she could satisfy him in, whether she was robbed of that blessing which was only due to his faith and love. But as it was very hard to get a sight of the women, for no men ever entered into the Otan, but when the king went to entertain himself with one of his wives or mistresses, and 'twas death at any other time for any other to go in, so he knew not how to contrive to get a sight of her. So basically, he decides that he wants to hear Imawinda's side. He wants to know, like, how did this happen? Like, how far have you gone with my grandfather? And are you still in love with me? But there's still a major block to this, which is that it's illegal for any man to go into this section of the palace to speak to or talk to or see any of the king's wives or mistresses unless they are specifically invited there by the king himself, because he's going to see one of his wives or mistresses and also wants to bring some of his friends along. So while Oroonooko felt all the agonies of love and suffered under a torment the most painful in the world, the old king was not exempted from his share of affliction. So again, we're going back to the king, and he does still have some problems on his conscience. He was troubled for having been forced by an irresistible passion to rob his son of a treasure he knew could not be but extremely dear to him, since she was the most beautiful that had ever been seen, and had besides all the sweetness and innocence of youth and modesty, with the charm of wit surpassing all. And he found that, however she was forced to expose her lovely person to his withered arms, she could only sigh and weep there and think of Oroonooko, and oftentimes could not forbear speaking of him, though her life were by custom forfeited by owning her passion. But she spoke not of a lover only, but of a prince dear to him, to whom she spoke, and of the praises of a man who, till now, filled the old man's soul with joy at every recital of his bravery or even his name. 'Twas this dotage on our young hero that gave Imawinda 1,000 privileges to speak of him, without offending, and this condescension in the old king that made her take the satisfaction of speaking of him so often. Okay, guys, we're gonna stop there. We're not quite done to what is considered section 1 of our assignments. This is going to be pages 4 through 11, and then I'll put up the next part of section 1, and then I'll also say in the video which assignment to do.